What you're about to see in this video is the story of a relatively forgotten and horrible place in China, where human beings were treated, in many ways, worse than lab animals by other human beings. 21st century Japan resembles 1940s Japan as much as today's Germany resembles the Nazi era, that is, not at all. But the Japanese of the World War II era committed horrible crimes. Facts are facts. Horrible atrocities have occurred in almost every nation and culture in history. They occur most often when ordered and encouraged by the country's leadership. Unfortunately, one of the things we have learned through history is that many people will become absolute brutes and monsters when they're encouraged to do so, or when they know they will face no legal consequences for their actions, at least not from their government. Japan has a unique history. From the early 17th century until the mid-19th century, the island nation was isolated from the world by order of the ruling shoguns, the military leaders who governed in the name of the emperor. Foreigners were only allowed on one small island near Nagasaki, and no Japanese were permitted to leave. Ever. This all changed in 1853–54 when American naval officer Matthew C. Perry forcibly opened Japan to international trade. What the naval officers and Marines in Perry's fleet saw when they came ashore shocked them. Japan had been suspended in time since the early 1600s. Its buildings, clothing, and especially weapons were 200 years behind America and the Western world. At the same time, China was becoming almost a vassal state of European countries. Sections of the country were under virtual foreign rule, and the Chinese had been forced to sign a series of what historians call the unequal treaties. Foreigners enjoyed favorable trade conditions, which allowed them to profit greatly while many Chinese suffered. Additionally, in those parts of China known as concessions, under European control or influence, European citizens, soldiers, and later Americans were subject to their own laws, not those of China. This included crimes committed against the Chinese. For all of these reasons and more, the Japanese were determined not to let that happen to their own country. They played one nation against another and occasionally used the threat of violent uprisings against the Western powers who came to trade in Japan. While at the same time understanding the limits of their own power and compromising with the West when necessary, the Japanese set themselves two main goals: to modernize their country as quickly as possible and to prevent the Western countries from doing to Japan what they were doing in China. After a period of civil strife, the Emperor Meiji was given executive power over the nation, and the shoguns were no more. From 1871 until 1905, the Japanese went from a country living in the 1600s to a modern industrial nation with modern armed forces. To the surprise of everyone except the Japanese, Japan won two wars, in 1894–1895 against China and in 1904–1905 against the Russian Empire. The Russian defeat shocked the world, and Japan wanted to be seen as an equal by the modern Western powers. Unfortunately, Japan and the West saw the world very differently. To a large degree, one of the ways in which they differed had to do with race and ethnicity. Having long led the world in military strength, technology, and economics, the West was reluctant to see the Japanese as equals. Much of this stemmed from racial bias, while some of it arose from the belief that the Japanese had merely learned from the Europeans. The Japanese, however, had seen their nation rise from a primarily backward agricultural society into a growing industrial power. They had defeated two much larger countries, China, which had long looked down on Japan as a tributary nation, and Russia, which believed its more modern army, navy, and soldiers would easily crush the smaller Japanese forces. What the Russians didn't realize was that the Japanese armed forces were more modern than theirs, with better trained troops and more skilled generals. Japan's victory over Russia filled the Japanese with pride. It proved to the world that their nation was equal to any Western power. Unfortunately, many Japanese believed they had been shortchanged by the Western powers in the talks that ended these wars. The trade rights and territorial concessions received after defeating the Russians discouraged many Japanese. They believed they had won and deserved more for their victory. In World War I, the Japanese sided with the Allies, keeping German naval forces bottled up in the Pacific and China. Yet for their effort, which was relatively small, Japan only gained control of a few German possessions in the Pacific. Even this was not enough for many Japanese. Two groups took the blame for Japan's perceived lack of respect: the civilian government and the Western powers. Many Japanese believed the Europeans, especially, conspired to keep Japan down. To a large degree, this was true. A powerful, and nearby, Japan could threaten British, Dutch, French, and American colonies, as well as business interests in Asia. The westernization of Japanese cities became a point of complaint for many Japanese, especially the conservative military. Western fashion, particularly for women, was taking over, and many women began pressing for equal rights and more job opportunities outside the home. Baseball and jazz music grew into two of Japan's most popular pastimes, and baseball still is today. Why are we telling you all this in a video about Japanese atrocities in World War II China? Because none of it makes sense unless you understand what caused them. By the early 1930s, Japan had become a military dictatorship. Throughout the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s, Japan transformed into a fascist country, just as dangerous to its own citizens as it was to its neighbors. Promoted by the Japanese military government through media, education, and mass rallies, these ideas shaped Japan's behavior and ideology. Japanese ethnic superiority, the importance of obedience and loyalty to the emperor, to the point of death, and a new version of what conservative Japanese believed to be the guiding principles of the samurai, these were the core ideals of the era. Among these principles were loyalty unto death, as just mentioned, and a disdain for anything not Japanese. This Bushido code resembled the ways of the ancient samurai mostly in name only. The people who bore the brunt of Japanese ethnocentrism were the Chinese. For centuries, the Chinese had demanded, and received, tribute from the Japanese in one form or another. As a result, Chinese culture dominated Japan. And though Japanese culture became unique over time, many of its religious ideas, writing systems, and cultural characteristics had Chinese roots. By the 20th century, most Japanese saw themselves like a child who had grown up to be more powerful and advanced than their parents. Combined with the ideas we just mentioned, the Japanese in China behaved much like the Nazis did in occupied Europe, superior and without regard for human life that wasn't Japanese. This shift reached a turning point in 1931. In 1936, the Japanese conquered the Chinese territory of Manchuria. They then invaded China and soon overran most of the eastern part of the country, especially the coastal cities. The treatment of the Chinese under Japanese occupation was abysmal, to say the least. One brutal atrocity followed another, the best known of which was the infamous rape of Nanking in 1937. The Japanese exploited the Chinese under their control economically, and China also became one vast laboratory. Its people were subjected not only to modern warfare but also to horrific experiments, as the Japanese military used them to research chemical and biological weapons. The war itself cost China millions of lives, both military and civilian. Estimates of Chinese losses from 1936 to 1945 range from 10 to 20 million people. And doing his best to increase that total was a monster named Shiro Ishii. Like Mengele at Auschwitz, Ishii was a doctor, but his atrocities were no less horrifying. He was born in 1892 into an established middle-class family and became a doctor in 1921. He joined the army as a surgeon. Ishii was fascinated by the process of infection, and after a trip to the battlefields of World War I Europe, he became interested in the possibilities of chemical and biological weapons. After spending 2 years on World War I battlefields and talking with the doctors and officers who had fought there, Ishii was recognized as an expert in the field of weapons of mass destruction. In 1936, Ishii was ordered to form a new unit. The unit's official name was No. 731 Water Purification Unit, but it was referred to as Unit 731 then and now. Ishii was joined by a number of other doctors, including his second-in-command, Dr. Hisato Yoshimura. There were other doctors on the staff, as well as a company or more of guards and assistants. Unit 731's home was an old fortress and prison camp near the northern Chinese city of Harbin. Up to 1,000 people could be housed inside the fortress complex at any one time. From the time of its inception until the end of the war, Unit 731 killed anywhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Most of those victims were killed, or allowed to die, not by firing squad, hanging, or other common forms of execution. The vast majority weren't gassed, as the Nazis did to their victims in the death camps of Poland. No, most of Unit 731's victims died as a result of experiments devised by Ishii Yoshimura and others. These experiments in death took many forms. It's estimated that thousands of Chinese in the surrounding areas were killed when Unit 731 released a variety of germs on the unsuspecting populace. These diseases included plague, typhus, and smallpox. Prisoners were injected with tuberculosis, cholera, gonorrhea, and syphilis, or forced to contract dysentery. Some were even subjected to flea bombs filled with plague. Infested insects were released in towns and villages. Children were given food poisoned with a variety of deadly chemicals, their bodies were then dissected and studied. Massive doses of tetanus vaccine, which caused uncontrollable muscle spasms, often leading to death, were administered within the prison. Doctors and soldiers wore protective suits. At times, figures in otherworldly biosuits would roam over areas of the countryside strewn with dead and dying people, not to help, but to see how lethal, long-lasting, and effective their biological weapons were. Experiments included exposure to incredible amounts of X-rays. The radioactive burns, both inside and outside the body, were studied after the victims died from this exposure. Many of the people dying from diseases deliberately given to them by members of Unit 731 were examined before their deaths. When we say examined, we mean that they were cut open in various ways, parts of their bodies removed, without anesthetic. Ishii and his staff wanted to witness the process of infection before serious internal and external damage set in. They believed that decomposition would affect or skew their results. Some experiments, which theoretically had some kind of purpose, seemed to have been created simply from pure sadism. People were burned to death with flamethrowers. They were exposed to chemical warfare agents, exposed meaning these agents were thrown on their naked bodies or forced down their throats and other orifices. Female prisoners were raped, some by male prisoners, under the stated purpose of studying the possibility of conception, even while infected with deadly diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. Many guards also became infected by raping prisoners, despite being officially forbidden from having sexual contact with them. Like the Nazi doctors, Ishii and his men exposed people to freezing temperatures and low-pressure chambers. They also induced heart attacks, forced abortions on prisoners and women who lived nearby, and conducted surgeries that were right out of a nightmare, arms removed and legs sewn in their place, the removal of sexual organs, etc. The list is almost endless and includes many more instances of sadism, some of which, we caution you, are even more disturbing than what has already been described in this video. When the war ended in September 1945, Ishii was in Japan. He was arrested by U.S. authorities, as were a number of his accomplices. As was the case with many wanted Nazi war criminals, Ishii was given immunity from prosecution. Again, he was given immunity from prosecution by the United States military government. Why? Because the U.S. believed that some of the data collected by Ishii during the war could be of use to America in any future conflict. Yes, you heard that right. Ishii died peacefully in 1959. A number of Ishii's officers and men were captured by the Soviets when they invaded northern China in the last days of the war. Amazingly, they received prison terms, not executions, despite some of them being sentenced to 20 or more years. Others were repatriated to Japan in the 1950s as part of a Soviet effort to improve relations with Japan. Even more shocking, members of Unit 731 openly held reunions in Japan after the war. It's hard to like a video like this, but if you found it interesting, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. Don't forget to click the bell icon to get notified of our next fascinating release.